One of the greatest scientists of all time, Johannes Kepler, is most famed for being the first to correctly describe the motion of the planets around the Sun. Prior to Kepler, the geocentric model of our solar system held sway, as its predictions were superior to the heliocentric ones of Copernicus. But Kepler came along, and after initially constructing his own heliocentric model with circular orbits for the planets, more than 400 years later, his three laws of planetary motion are still taught and studied all across the world. However, Kepler also used his mathematical prowess to solve a very different terrestrial problem that many of us still face in our lives here on Earth. When is the optimal time to marry someone, assuming you want to maximize the happiness in your life? The answer, perhaps surprisingly, is to follow what's known as the 37% rule. Reject the first 37% of all possible choices and then pick the very next one to come along whose potential exceeds the best of the 37% who came before. Although some will wind up passing over their optimal choice and others will choose a partner before ever meeting their best possible match, the 37% rule is the mathematically superlative strategy. Here's the science behind why. To be clear, the marriage puzzle that we're talking about is the puzzle as it applied in Kepler's day, not as it is today. Whereas today, divorce is common, open, polyamorous relationships are not shunted to the fringes of society, and choosing a new partner isn't stigmatized in the same way, Kepler's idea of marriage was more akin to an enormous, irrevocable decision. Back in Kepler's day, many things were true that are no longer true today, including you had to marry someone before you could truly spend enough time with them to know what life with them would be like. Marriage was a one-time proposition. Once you married someone, you would be stuck with them until you die. And marriage meant the exclusion of all other potential partners once you made your selection. Even though, of course, this is not exactly how marriage worked in practice, the concept of the puzzle, where you can peruse many options and say yes, no to everyone. But once you make your choice, it's yours to live with forever and you never get to choose again, is very similar to a myriad of choices that many of us will face over the course of our lifetimes. The way to think about this puzzle from a mathematical point of view is that you can imagine there's some way of measuring your outcome, happiness in this case, with each of your potential choices. You don't know what the maximum possible value of your outcome is. You're only capable of ranking the potential candidates according to your own experiences and perceptions. However, it's very clear that there are two major potential pitfalls that can occur when having to make a big decision in life where you only get one chance that you'll have to live with forever after. You can choose the first good thing that comes along and try to be content with that, although this will give you an outcome where you supposedly have more happiness in your life than if you didn't ever choose anything at all. Choosing something too soon means you run the risk of being unable to choose a better option if one should come along again later. Or you can reject the early candidate options that come along in the beginning, waiting until an incredible option comes along that simply blows away everything previous that you had to consider. The downside here is that your potentially optimal choice might be front-loaded in your experience, and if you wait for someone to surpass that option, you might wind up alone, as that option may never present itself to you. So, all other things being equal, what should your strategy when faced with a situation like this, where you get one choice among many different candidates, where you must either say yes or no to each option shortly after encountering it, where you don't get to test various options out at once or return to a previous option after rejecting it, and where once you decide yes to any option, the game is over? Believe it or not, the answer for arriving at the optimal strategy doesn't depend on many of the things you might expect it would. It doesn't depend on how much happiness you see in your future with the first option that comes along. It doesn't depend on when, assuming you reject the first option, a better option than that first one comes along. It doesn't depend on what the difference is between your best and worst option among the first several candidate choices. And it doesn't depend on the amount that your best option so far outpaces all of the other options that you encountered. The only thing your answer should depend on from a mathematical point of view is knowing how many potential options you're likely to encounter over the relevant time frame. Isn't that a weird bit of information? But statistically, it's absolutely true. As long as you know the total number of options you'll be presented with, then your strategy for how you should make your choice is determined solely by that. Assuming that the candidates will appear to you in random order without any bias given to when you're most likely to see your most preferred outcomes, the answer is as follows. No matter how much you like any of the early options that are presented to you, you should unilaterally reject the first 37%, technically the first 36.7% of all options that you encounter. However, you should remember honestly, and without either rose-colored glasses or sour grapes, what the best option you've seen so far is, and that should serve as your standard for comparison. Then, the very next time you encounter an option that you deem is superior to that previous best option you remembered, you should choose that option and never look back, although you'll still have a chance at a bad outcome, where either a better candidate comes along than the option you'll wind up choosing, or no superior candidate to the one you rejected earlier ever emerges. This strategy will maximize your chances of choosing the best possible option you'll encounter in your life. What are your odds of getting the best outcome? Did Kepler really have anything to do with it? In mathematical circles, this puzzle has many names and is perhaps best known as the secretary problem rather than the marriage problem. However, it's well documented that the true origin of this problem goes all the way back to Johannes Kepler, who considered it in great detail from the years 1611 to 1613, after the death of his first wife. Kepler, while expected to remarry, wanted to ensure that he was making a sound choice. Over the ensuing 2 years, he not only spent time meticulously interviewing and researching 11 potential suitors for himself, he worked out the probabilities. Again, assuming a random distribution of what sort of true happiness he could arrive at with each of the potential candidates, of what sort of outcome he would arrive at dependent on which choice he made. Assuming he'd encounter his 11 suitors sequentially, Kepler concluded that he should do his best to measure or estimate his happiness with each of his first 4 candidates, and irrespective of how he felt about them, even how he felt about them relative to his first wife, he should reject them all. Although there was about 36.3% chance that one of those 4 would be his best match, there was a 63.6% that someone would be better than each of those 4 in the sample still to come. Out of those 7, so long as he picked the first one that he deemed superior to the first 4 options, he'd obtain the best chance of maximizing his happiness. It's all the more remarkable considering that natural logarithms were not even discovered until a little bit later, 1614. The problem came up again and again in subsequent years and has been applied to a variety of situations, hiring a job candidate, choosing a college, along with many variants where you could potentially return to previously rejected options. One notable variant is known as the postdoc problem, where your goal is not to pick the best candidate, but rather the second best candidate, as the assumption is that the best candidate will go to Harvard, so if you pick them, you'll lose out. In that instance, it turns out that even with an optimal strategy, your probability of choosing your desired option is at best 1 by 4, demonstrating that it's easier to pick the best option rather than the second best option. This general class of problem mathematically is known as an optimal stopping problem, where you have to take a decisive action after having gathered some sampling experience with the goal of maximizing your payoff. Although there are many more complexities to all incarnations of this problem, in reality, whether it's making a big-ticket purchase, embarking on a romantic endeavor, or choosing a direction for your career, the notion of sampling first, followed by taking decisive action at an opportune time, is a universal aspect in achieving the maximum possible payoff. Although no strategy can guarantee you'll make the optimal decision, the way to maximize your probability of choosing the best is on firm mathematical footing. More than 400 years after Kepler, it's still relevant to apply his lessons learned in probability to all of the biggest decisions in our lives. Thank you so much for joining us today. See you soon again in the next video. Until then, good night and stay curious.